Good afternoon, everyone. The mayor's veto of Intro 586 of the How Many Stops Act today was an affront to transparency, an affront to oversight, and part of a continued pattern from this administration of shielding the NYPD from scrutiny while weakening our already far too weak systems for holding discriminatory and abusive policing in check. And the bill that was described by the mayor this morning, and the messaging, the misinformation that has been coming out of City Hall and the NYPD on this legislation in the past few days has really been shocking. The bill as described by the administration is very different from the bill that the City Council actually passed. So let's talk a bit about what the How Many Stops Act is, and what it will actually accomplish for New Yorkers. The mayor suggested that the issue with Intro 586 was that the council didn't know what was covered by level 1 encounters. That's simply not true. The lead sponsors knew what a level 1 encounter is. The council members who voted with a supermajority to enact this legislation know what a level 1 encounter is. The issue is simply that the NYPD does not want to document and report on these encounters. The NYPD wants to continue hiding its practices at these levels and is reluctant to make that information public because they fear that it will prove what we all know, which is that racial disparities exist at all levels of police investigatory activity. We heard that the How Many Stops Act is going to take officers away from crime fighting, is going to make New Yorkers less safe. This could not be further from the truth. This legislation is very simple, straightforward transparency that would be easy for the NYPD to implement with the tools and the resources that they already have. And that's not just us saying that. This was examined by retired Judge Belen, who was the facilitator for the joint remedial process following the stop and frisk litigation, who made a recommendation that these encounters be documented and found that with officers' smartphones, this is something that can be accomplished within a matter of seconds. This is not as was depicted in some of the very creative videos coming from the administration in recent days. This is not burying officers in paperwork. This is simply a matter of officers taking out the devices that they already have, that they already use to document their activities, and selecting a few pieces of information from drop-down menus that will be accomplished in a matter of seconds. This is not that complicated. And this is not something that is going to take minutes to fill out. We are literally talking a matter of seconds. There was discussion that we do not need this level of reporting and documentation because we're talking about low-level encounters where people are not being suspected of criminal activity. But let's look at the reality of how New Yorkers actually experience these investigatory encounters. The NYPD loves to trot out the example of the missing child. What about the cases where officers at level 1 are going up to a group of young people, asking them to produce identification, asking what they're doing in a particular neighborhood, where they're going, do they live in this building? Those are all encounters that New Yorkers experience with a level of intimidation, a level of fear, and a real risk of escalation, that those encounters could become much more serious, lead to a use of force, lead to enforcement activity, lead to all of the racially discriminatory patterns of policing that we see across all categories of NYPD enforcement activity. And lastly, I would just say these are all encounters where we are still talking about officers needing to have some kind of legal justification to initiate them in the first place. We're not talking about casual interactions and conversations. We're talking about something where an officer actually does need to meet a legal standard in order to initiate that interaction. And there is no way for us to actually have real oversight and know if officers are meeting those legal standards if we don't have baseline data to know how often these encounters are happening, where they are happening, and who they are targeting. This is simple, basic transparency, easy for the NYPD to implement, and it is all the more necessary given this administration's default approach to solving every societal problem, to answering every question by just throwing more police at it and hoping that that fixes the issue. This is an administration that has ramped up the number of reported stops, as we just heard. It's an administration that has increased the number of low-level summons and arrest activity. Vehicle stops are happening at eye-popping numbers, And across the board, we are seeing really severe racial disparities. If we're going to have an administration that is so adamant about prioritizing policing, we need to know what that actually translates to in terms of impacts on communities. That's why the How Many Stops Act was written. That's why the council passed it with a supermajority. And that's why the council will override this veto and ensure that this critical piece of legislation becomes law.